Salutations, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. So this video is about the endgame in Syria, or at least I think it is. The Syrian civil war has been going on for 8 years now. This was spring of 2011 when the Arab Spring came to the Syrian Arab Republic. And there's been this ghastly civil war. Obviously, that's got to be a relative term. Civil wars are never pretty, but this one has been just unusually horrific. A country of 10 million people, in which at least 200,000 people have been killed, and several times that number have been wounded. Some of them mutilated, some of them scarred for life, or they've had to have limbs amputated, blinded, things like that. Not trifling wounds, not the wounds that will always heal. That's what I'm talking about. And obviously, at least 2 million people have fled the country. Lots of other internally displaced people, as in who've had to move from one part of Syria to another, people who've been taken prisoner or kidnapped, often treated barbarously, tortured and so forth. And the physical infrastructure of the country has been destroyed in a great number of cases, many cities almost leveled. So it was never a wealthy country, but the economy has been wrecked, heavily dependent on financial support from China, Russia, Iran, and elsewhere. So this 8-year civil war, how many years will it take to recover from that? Decades, I would submit. So anyway, it looks like the conflict is drawing to a close. It won't come to a definite end, just as it didn't have a definite beginning. It'll probably rumble on at a lower level for several more years. But what was the situation at the start? Well, Bashir al-Assad was the president of Syria. He became president in 2000, at the age of 34, upon the death of his father Hafiz al-Assad, who'd seized power in a coup in the 70s. His father was an Air Force officer. So he led the Ba'ath party, Ba'ath being resurgence in Arabic. The Socialist Party of Arab Resurgence is its full name. It was founded in the 1940s by Michel Aflaq, a Syrian Christian. So the Ba'athists, they're about pan-Arabism, trying to unite all Arabs, so they didn't have much success. In the early 60s, Syria and Egypt, they briefly united. Now, they're not geographically contiguous, but it broke down over who was top dog, Nasser or the Syrian president. But that's why Egypt's official name is still the United Arab Republic. So the flag is the colours of Arab nationalism, black, white, red, with a green stars in this case, but also secularism. It's true that 9 out of 10 Arabs are Muslims, but they don't seek to promote Islam, or especially not a particular denomination of Islam. So they can say that a Christian or a Druze or whatever can be just as good an Arab as a Muslim of either denomination. So that's it. You can practice Islam or any other faith. The government will not support or oppose any other faith, and that's a step forward. But certainly anti-imperialist, some would submit anti-Western, detest Zionism. That's what they're about. A bit of socialist rhetoric. There was a bit of public ownership in the early days. Not communists, though they lent in that direction. So it was a Soviet ally for decades, and obviously since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, been a Russian ally subsequently. So been a stalwart foe of Israel. Now, the majority of people in Syria speak Arabic as their first language. Arabic's the only official language there. And most people there are Sunni. That's the major Muslim denomination, about 75% Sunni. They're about 10% Christian, about 10% Shia, the other major Muslim denomination. There's subdivisions within Shiaism, how many imams you believe, 7 or 12 and so on. Now, there's a subset of Shia Muslims called the Alawi, and Bashir al-Assad is one of those. There are also Druze people, they're schismatics who split off Islam in the 11th century AD. A few Yazidis. Yazidis say they worship the peacock angel. Muslims generally say, oh, that means the devil. But there we are. So I'm just trying to see what I need to press here. Anyway, so people have been fed up of this one-party state, this familial dictatorship, the lack of freedom of expression, and mild dissent was violently repressed. The state was very intolerant of this, so the economy wasn't growing, a lot of unemployed young men and so on. They saw how government had been overthrown almost bloodlessly in Tunisia, democracy instituted. They saw how Mubarak's corrupt dictatorship in Egypt was overthrown, thinking it would lead to something better. It didn't. As we now know, it's led to something worse. That's partly because of the deep state in Egypt, the military, police and so on, they hadn't let democracy develop and just overthrew it. Yeah, democracy faced problems in Egypt. It's not as though dictatorship didn't, and so on. So there we are. They always heard that Western governments preaching democracy and thought it might actually be welcomed in Syria. So peaceful protesters are shot down. What else can people do to effect change? Now, there were some reasonable people who wanted Assad gone, but the other people who were not just against the ophthalmologist, Assad, but they wanted to bring in a caliphate, as in rule of Sharia law. Remember, there was a caliphate until 1924, because the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings upon him, had his Khalifa, or successor, that's what it means, the Arabic word, and the Caliph, as we often anglicize it, was meant to be the successor of the Prophet Muhammad, descended from him. A great number of people are descended from him because he had about a dozen wives, only 4 at one time though. And so many people can claim to be descended from him. I don't know if that's true or not, if they really are descended. And then rule in his way. And the Ottoman Empire, when it existed, had its sultan, was also the caliph, as in supposed successor to the Prophet Muhammad. How do we know it was him and not anybody else? So loads of people descended from him. You only got a tiny drop of his blood. You know, about 1 million people are descended from him. Not really, not exaggerating. If he only had 2 surviving children, well, he had a lot more. And the next generation, they had 4. And the next generation, they had 8. And then 16 and 32 and blah, blah, blah. You know, how many do you have after, say, 50 generations? Well, an awful lot. Anyway, so going back to Syria. So major uprising there and some people deserting from the army. So it's quite a multi-ethnic place, okay? Even though everyone can speak Arabic, there's a Kurdish minority, particularly in the north east of the country, speaking the Kurdish language. They're Sunni Muslims almost without exception. And, you know, they're Bedouin, as in they wander around the desert with their herds of camels. And they're Sunni Muslims, usually Arabic speaking, but they're divided into different tribes. They don't have a strong identification with any nation state. Now, you can be a Bedouin, a kind of a settled Arab as well. It's not completely bifurcated between the two. They're Turkomans, as in people ethnically Turkish or speaking a language very close to Turkish, the very northern part of the country. So it's much more multi-ethnic and multi-linguistic than you might first realise. There's an Armenian community there, speaking the Armenian language as well as Arabic, and they're Christian to a man. So a rebellion started out as a group called the Syrian Democratic Forces, set itself up in the Syrian Free Syria Army, largely the same outfit, saying for liberal democratic principles, we want the right to vote for every adult. We want real elections, not these sort of charade elections we've had under the Assad dynasty, where sometimes they would only allow certain parties contest them. You're an extremist if you actually opposed Assad. And some people who were even allowed to vote, allowed to stand for election, when they were elected, then the dictatorship would simply say, well, that doesn't count in your case because, you know, you're not blindly loyal to us. So you're either with us or you're evil. You know, they didn't accept the idea of loyal opposition. So no freedom of expression. Now, so the Assad dictatorship was very wicked, very cruel, but there was something to be said for it. As I say, that you had freedom in the personal sphere. As I've got a friend who's half Syrian, half Russian, who's an outspoken Assad supporter. I found it quite horrific, but he does say some things. Under Assad, a woman had the right to wear a pair of shorts and walk down the street and could do so without being in fear, which she couldn't do in many other Muslim countries. So the right to wear what you want, to eat what you want, to drink what you want, to dance, to play sport, including as a woman, and things like that, to show your face and your hair in public. And none of which would apply in many other Muslim countries. Christians could worship freely, as well as Muslims of various denominations. But so there were mosques, but it's widely believed that anyone who ran a mosque, whether Sunni or Shia, had to be on the side of the president and be an informer. If anyone trash talks the president, you have to tell the secret police, they'll be arrested. By the way, the Air Force had a great deal of power in that country. There was Air Force intelligence, almost functioning like an internal intelligence agency against civilians, partly because Dr. al-Assad's father, as I say, was commander of the Air Force before he seized power. So they'd lost the Golan Heights to Israel years ago, illegally occupied by Israel, and now they've got the Israelis named a village there after Trump. So yeah, lots of fighting, and then some people were Islamists who were fighting against him, who were Sunni Muslims, not just ordinary Sunni Muslims, but actually anti-Shia, and usually killing any Shia civilian or indeed Christian civilian they got their hands on, wanting to bring in the caliphate. So now the Syrian Democratic Forces of the Free Syria Army were, as well as the Islamists, were against the Ba'athist regime, but for different reasons. So some of the Islamists, they found the Al-Nusra Front in Syria, which is really a subsection of Al-Qaeda, because Al-Qaeda, meaning the base in Arabic, that was Osama bin Laden's outfit, is a sort of a franchise. You can set up yourself up as a branch of it, as it were. It exists in Mali and Nigeria, and as Boko Haram and so forth. Because remember, when the state controlled everything, the only thing that wasn't directly controlled by the state was the mosque. The only people who could meet, socialize, discuss things. But you better not badmouth the government too much, because you'd never know. He has got long ears. His informants are everywhere. So that was that. So it comes back to say, well, what, like the Russian dichotomy, you can either have tyranny or you can have anarchy. So which is worse? Well, anarchy appeared to be more of a dystopia. Certainly that's what they'd have you believe. Could you not have freedom, under law, like so many other parts of the world? No, that's impossible. But anyway, people dared to hope for better, and perhaps it was a forlorn hope. Although we know in about 2015 that Al-Nusra Front, it morphed into something called ISIS, the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. Al-Shams, as they call it in the Arabic language, that's Syria. But it stretched from Syria into Iraq, because they recognize no boundary, and they consider, well, this is all Dar al-Islam, the land of Islam, uniting all all Sunni Muslims and trying to drive out or kill all Sunni Muslims and so on, and Christians. So there are four major Sunni schools of jurisprudence. There's the Salafi one, which is perhaps the most reactionary, obscurantist, and puritanical one, very popular in Saudi Arabia. There's a version of it called Wahhabism, because of this 18th century cleric from Riyadh called Abd al-Wahhab, who was sponsored by the Saudi royal family. Saudis were a small tribe. Riyadh was a small town until the 20th century, but that's where it started out. Obviously, when Saudi Arabia struck it rich with oil in the 1960s, they were bankrolling Wahhabi preachers around the Muslim world. And this had an effect, including in Syria. But the Syrian government had been deeply suspicious of this for a long time. We've been here before. In the early 80s, there was another Sunni rebellion in Syria, not suggesting that most Sunnis were on a side at all, but a significant number were. And so the Syrian government decided they weren't having this. There was a city called Hamma, which was the stronghold of the Salafists, and the Syrian military surrounded Al-Hamma and decided the way to do this once and for all was, as Niccolò di Machiavelli suggested, was a massacre, and it's got to be an absolute massacre, sparing neither age nor sex, and kill every single last man, woman, and child in that city, such that nobody will be left alive to try and seek revenge 20 years hence, and to do it only once, but to do it totally. And so they carried out that crime against humanity, not apologizing for it, and nor indeed denying it. And so Hafiz al-Assad was the president at the time, and his brother Rifat was in command of that operation, and he later was bragging about the scale of the slaughter. So there we are. Anyway, so ISIS was just as bad as the Syrian government. The thing is, the Syrian government did stand for the values of the Enlightenment in some ways, even though it carried out these many hideous massacres. So obviously, Dr. al-Assad, the president, is abominated by majority of his people. If he wasn't hated by them, why couldn't he allow freedom of expression? Why couldn't he allow fair elections? He must know he's going to lose. After 8 years of war, even now he only controls about half his country. For much of the time, he controlled perhaps as little as 30% of his landmass, and maybe not even 30% of the population. So he controlled some of the bigger cities. He lost control of other big cities. And he was only able to cling on with massive foreign support. The Iranians piling in, sending their army units and the Revolutionary Guard. And obviously the Russian military, particularly the Russian Air Force. The Russians not doing that much ground fighting. Various Russian private military companies, should I call them mercenaries, like Wagner, fighting on the ground, including fighting against the US military. and the Chinese really bankrolling him. It's not a wealthy country at the best of times, but the economy largely ground to the halt. The few exports, where they weren't exporting anything, were hardly producing anything, and didn't have money to buy weapons. So they're obviously up to their neck in debt to China and Russia and so on. So Russia wanted to protect their foothold. Their only base is in the Middle East. It gives them a lot of leverage. Russia's got an immensely complex relationship with Israel, and in Israel, at least 10% of the population are descended from people from Russia or other Russian-speaking countries, Jewish people who are Russian descent, or say Kazakh descent, but still using Russian as their first language as well as Hebrew. So it gives Russia a bargaining chip with regard to Israel. There's a very complicated relationship, in some ways friendly, but on the other hand, Russia's been the armorer of Syria, the main anti-Israeli power in the region, which obviously borders Israel, some Syrian sovereign territories under Israeli illegal occupation. You might say, well, that's because the Syrians attacked the Israelis. I mean, that's true, but Israel still got it, even though the UN told them to get out. What else? So partly it's just grandstanding. It's just vaingloriousness, saying, "Oh, I've got a big swinging dick. Look at me, woo! I'm a power in the world." Rather than spending the money on actually improving the lives of your people, paying off the national debt, better public services, cleaning up the environment, something to help the average person, does it really make your life better that you have more of the sand? I don't think it does. So the Iranians piled in on the side of Assad. So he's a Shia, even though he's not religious. Remember, Iran is the Islamic Republic of Iran, about 90% Shia, and there's a Sunni minority. They're allowed to worship. There's even an ethnically Arab minority. Remember, the Iranians, yes, they're Muslims in the great majority of cases, but they are not Arabs. Being Arab is a linguistic thing. The Iranian language is Persian. You cannot call it Farsi if you want in the Farsi language. There's no such language as Iranian. That's that. But then they're not Arabs. They've got a small Arab minority, about 2% of the population, who live close to the border with Iraq. And Iran's got a Christian population allowed to worship freely, a tiny Jewish community who are represented in the Majlis of the Iranian parliament. So anyway, Israel got spooked about all these Iranian troops on their border. Remember, Lebanon is a society which is almost equally divided between Sunni, Shia, Muslims. Where was I educated? I was educated in Great Britain and Ireland latterly. Well, I went to an American school in Saudi Arabia when I was little. I went to boarding school in Great Britain, prep school. Yeah, one in Banffshire, latterly Berkshire, Oxford University, and then I've done various other qualifications at the London School of Journalism. I got CELTA from Cambridge University. I've got a law degree from the University of London, and I've got a master's degree from the University of Limerick in linguistics. I've also done courses, non-degree bearing courses at the University of Buckingham and the National University of Singapore. Does that answer your question? Well, I've got a qualification from Global English College. I think that's it. The Israelis were bombing these Iranian positions in Syria, but often they were deconflicting these with the Russians, sorting out, these are your coordinates, okay, so we're not going to hit you, because they don't want to antagonize each other. And that was that. So Russia's achieved quite a diplomatic feat of managing to retain cordial relations with both the State of Israel and Iran at the same time, despite the two being at daggers drawn, facing off at this conflict. So the Iranians, they've helped the Lebanese a lot. Hezbollah, as in Party of God, is a Shia party thank you, Bray Anderson. Well, please spread the word. Persuade your friends and neighbors to subscribe. I'm not completely ignorant, as you might concur. The Hezbollah is a Shia party in Lebanon, very closely aligned with the Iranian government. And the 2006 war against Israel, the Iranians gave them weapons and money. And the Iranian president, he always gets red carpet treatment when he visits Lebanon. So there's a very complex interplay between the competing powers in the region. The United States weighed in. I was going to say, what are the reasons why China and the Russian Federation were very keen to prevent Assad falling? Is it really he was their man? They tend to favour the status quo. He's their sort of secular dictator. He's a bit anti-Western. I mean, he's not totally anti-Western. He's an ophthalmologist. He did part of his training in London. His wife Asma, she's a British Syrian. But anyway, They see him as their guy. Remember, they voted for those UN Security Council resolutions in 2011, authorizing the use of force in Libya to protect civilians. The idea being that as Muammar al-Gaddafi was trying to quell that revolt in the eastern part of Libya, that he would slaughter civilians, as in that's very likely he would have done. He'd done this kind of thing before. Remember 1998, the prison massacres, hundreds of prisoners in Libya were simply killed, usually without a trial, and even if they had one, they weren't accused of a capital crime like murder or treason usually. But anyway, the Chinese and the Russians felt that they'd been conned. They had voted for this resolution thinking there would be some use of air power by NATO, but it wouldn't actually start to function as the rebels' air force, but they did, and NATO effectively assisted the insurrection, bombing the Libyan security forces, overthrew Gaddafi, who'd been a thorn in the West side for decades, and that was that. So the Russians and the Chinese drew a line in the sand this far and no further. We're backing him to the hilt. So it's obviously cost them quite a lot of money, but they're deeply invested and it's worked for them. So he's very grateful to them. He's been to Moscow a lot. And indeed, I mean, the word on the street I heard is that his wife and children spent quite a lot of time in Moscow. The president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, he has spoken with fulsome praise about Dr. al-Assad. Anyway, so 2015, ISIS emerged. They'd taken over quite a section of Syria and indeed Iraq. Now, it suited the Syrian regime for this to happen because they always want to say, oh, Syrian Democratic Forces, no, they're on Al-Qaeda. There are no peaceful protesters. In 2011, it was armed terrorist gangs, despite there being ample evidence that unarmed people were shot dead by the hundred. And so it's sort of the big lie theory that, you tell an outright lie unblushingly, endlessly, and a lot of people will fall for it. As Churchill said, you can fool some of the people all the time, just relentlessly barraging people with that lie. Or that there can be no secular democratic opposition. You must be an Al-Qaeda type. Now, in fairness, some of them really are Al-Qaeda types, but then the Syrian government deliberately trying to destroy the Syrian Democratic Forces and the Free Syria Army, the secular liberal rebels, so that there would be only the al-Nusra Front or ISIS left. And so Western countries backing the Free Syria Army, the al-Nusra Front, the UK providing non-lethal aid, as in radios, tents, ready meals, first aid packs, whatever, and flak jackets, goggles, helmets, but nothing to actually kill people. Is Libya stable right now? There's still fighting going on, not very much. So Libya has got an internationally recognized government with a UN seat for Libya. But then Khalifa Haftar is leading a rebellion in Libya. Haftar is an intriguing character who is a general under Muammar Gaddafi's army. So about 1985, Libya invaded Chad, that former French colony to its south, trying to claim the Alzou Strip. But they were defeated. The French had their military in Chad, and French jets bombed them. They didn't fight on the ground. They let the Chadians do that. The United States was involved. The CIA was there. So they defeated Haftar and captured him and several hundreds of his men. So the conflict came to an end. Do you want to be sent back to Libya to face Gaddafi's wrath for having faced? They made him an offer. Do you want to come over to our side? So he did. So several hundred Libyan prisoners chose to stay in Chad, forming the sort of exile legion. The idea being when the moment was propitious, the United States would send them back into Libya to overthrow Muammar al-Gaddafi. Remember Gaddafi, Colonel Gaddafi, he seized power in 1969. He only ranked as the rank of colonel, pretty good at the age of 29, overthrew King Idris and ruled ever since. Gaddafi wasn't president, wasn't prime minister. He had the title brotherly guide of the revolution of the great socialist peoples, Libyan peoples, Islamic Arab Jamahiriya. Honestly, it was that vainglorious and faintly silly, the constitutional title of the country. But I can't remember what the question was. Well, Khalifa Haftar, he then moved to the United States and became a US citizen. And then in recent years, he's returned to Libya and he's got his own little band of thugs. So Haftar and his merry men. He's spouted Islamist rhetoric sometimes. Now he's turned against ISIS and he's killed lots of prisoners. Slave trade has been started in Libya. Yeah, so I've heard actually. And so he's attacking the legitimate government of Libya. the legitimate government of Libya doesn't control very much of the country. He was in Moscow last year meeting Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. So all this, Lavrov says we support international law, which is absolute bull because they're breaking international law, sponsoring an insurrection in a sovereign state, Libya, with which they have diplomatic relations, when Russia has recognized the government. Now you might say, oh, well, Western countries do that too, and they have sometimes done that too. But, you know, two wrongs don't make a right. Don't tell me that you rigidly adhere to international law when you flagrantly don't. So, you know, he's a bargaining chip for them. They could support him. They could withdraw support, depending on what they get out of the Libyan government or other countries. So who would trust him, you know? Who was Gaddafi's man, who was pro-American, he now seems to be pro-Russian, who was Islamist and now is anti-Islamist. Does he believe in anything? He's in his 70s and reportedly ill, so he's not a safe bet for the long term. Anyway, so back to Syria. So ISIS had expanded their territory greatly. They're making money from oil and indeed from kidnapping people, taxing people, setting off bombs in Turkey. In 2015, there was this flagrant lie in the Russian state media. Almost all the media in Russia is pro-state, saying that the Turkish government was supporting ISIS. What? Despite ISIS setting off bombs in Turkey? Are you out of your mind? But this is sort of projection, because obviously the Russian government 20 years ago set off lots of bombs in Russia, blowing up lots of apartment blocks. I'll give you a chapter on verse, and that's some other time. But they're accusing the Turkish government of doing this. Why on earth would they want to do that? What's the gain? They look weak. People lose faith in the government. So Turkey had actually had a very cordial relationship with the Assad dictatorship. You know, in the 2000s, it's been quite bad in the 90s. They'd almost fought over the border, partly because when Syria was a French colony, the French gave a chunk of it to the Turks in the late 1930s to try and keep them sweet. Didn't really work. But anyway, they wanted in 2011 there were massive scale demonstrations, and that the Turkish government was saying to President al-Assad, we've got to have reform, like real reform, not the pretend reform we've been talking about. Since the day he was inaugurated in 2000, he's been talking about reform, and which never, ever happened. You can see why people gave up hope of a peaceful transition. So the US and other Western countries were backing the rebels. They didn't actually want Assad to collapse, maybe negotiate a handover, said he must go. But the Russians said, no, he's a president, he's a legitimate president, and denying the countless massacres and the large-scale torture carried out by his regime, no matter how absolutely incontrovertible the evidence, they would deny. So 2013, number of chemical attacks on Syrian civilians, which obviously be in areas held by the rebels, and the Syrian government and or the Russian military carrying this out. And of course, they would blindly deny that they'd done this, that anyone had died of a chemical attack, despite the evidence, try to prevent any investigators getting in there to get soil samples. When the UN voted to investigate it, Russia would say, but you can't apportion blame. Now, why would Moscow say you can't apportion blame? Because they know their government did it. That's the only logical explanation why they're saying that. They got large-scale chemical weapons anyway. So that is the strategy. Remember Kim Philby, that British guy who was a Soviet agent? I saw the clip of a speech he gave to the German secret police in the early 80s. He said, never, ever confess. Why be a witness against yourself? No matter what happens, you just say, if they give you a document written in your own hand, incriminating document, it's a forgery. If they play your recording of your own voice saying something incriminating, you say that they've edited it in a misleading way. That's where you just lie. So that's that. So although the Turkish government was so evil, according to Moscow in 2015, within a couple of years, Putin and Erdogan were best buds. Erdogan's been invited to Moscow, been there a couple of times in the past few years. So he used to be evil, pro-ISIS, now he's not. Come off it. So this is ludicrous. It just shows that the flagrant lying, which really is a Russian foreign policy. And I'm not suggesting other governments don't lie, just not as much. Not as frequently, they're not such whoppers of lies. Better if nobody lied, but being realistic, people do. So we know that ISIS expanded. Donald Trump, well, he was saying to get out of there. But anyway, the Western countries, because there were UN Security Council resolutions, partly because of the big slayings in France in the autumn of 2015, and various NATO countries have started bombing ISIS and helped really shrink the territory. It was controlled by ISIS. The Iraqi government counterattacked with a lot of Iranian help. Putin wants to destroy the UK and the USA with SA assistance, South African assistance. They both want land, wealth, land and resources. I don't think he does want to destroy them. What would Putin want? Well, he would want to recreate the Soviet Union as far as possible, not the economic sense, not communism. A question off topic, but where are we with Brexit? Do you think the deal is still possible? No, I don't think it's going to happen for various reasons. Let me do another video about some other time. I'm absolutely bored to tears talking about Brexit. But Putin said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the geopolitical calamity of the 20th century. But I have to disagree with him. It was a prison for peoples, the Russian people too. I remember Donald Tusk, one of the few things I completely concur with, saying it was a wonderful thing for Georgians who were held there against their will, and indeed for Russians. All these other indigenous ethnic minorities, Armenians, Kazakhs, blah, blah, blah. The moment that they had the chance to choose independence, they chose it. The next Douglas Murray, I knew Douglas Murray actually. I was at school with him and university with him. When I very first met Douglas Murray when he was 17, he told me he was writing a biography of Oscar Wilde, and I thought, yeah, right. He really was, and he had it published. An exceptionally talented boy. Oh, Saudi Arabia. Well, the thing is, Putin's always saying, I'm against Islamic extremism, despite having a very cozy relationship with the most Islamic extremist country in the world, Saudi Arabia, which is worse than Iran. You know, Saudi Arabia just allowed women to drive, the last country in the world to do so. Still doesn't allow women's sport. You know, still women have to cover their hair in public. The most oppressive country around, apart from, say, North Korea. And I used to live in Saudi Arabia as a child. So where are we with regard to the Syrian conflict? So now, much of the United States wouldn't like to admit this. Who has really defeated ISIS? It's the Russians and the Iranians. The Russian Air Force and the Iranian boots on the ground. And so the Iraqis are about 60% Shia. Now, I'm not saying all Shia are against all Sunnis or all Sunnis are against all Shia, but ISIS are against anyone who's not a Sunni Muslim, a walking encyclopedia. Tar Muchley. Well, I know, I wish I could find a better outlet for it, something remunerative, because yes, I am extremely well clued up because I'm an information addict when it comes to ethnography, geopolitics, philology, things of that nature. But I'm afraid I'm staggeringly ignorant with technology, hence the poor nature of these videos. Anything scientific, you know. Well, I know how babies are made. I can switch on a light, flush a laboratory just occasionally. Anyway, so the US has got involved, and indeed it's got boots on the ground in Syria. They mostly pulled out of Iraq under Obama because he tried to have a new deal with the Iraqi government to keep many of them there. But they said, no, all right, you're not going to keep troops there against the Iraqis' will. Is it possible for Iran not to get into war with the US? I know Trump wants it badly. Yes, it is possible, but that's up to them because the Iranians, obviously, they're defending their land. They're supporting the Houthi rebels in Yemen. There's a large Shia minority in Yemen. They're backing them up. Now, the Iranian government is not anti-Sunni. They've got a good relationship with Turkey, which has got almost no Shia. They got a cordial relationship with Qatar, which is hugely, well, like 90% Sunni. So that's that. So there's a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia and Syria, and a proxy war between them, likewise in Yemen. So the Saudi Arabians bombing Yemen and killing large numbers of civilians. I know bombing necessarily kills civilians, but just how many? You can't avoid it. Supposing there's a building, you know there are 10 enemy soldiers in there and 1 civilian. Would you bomb it and kill them all? That's a question of military ethics. You probably would. What if it was 10 civilians and 1 enemy soldier? You probably wouldn't. What if it was 10 soldiers and 10 civilians? Do you do it then? Thing is, if you're too ethical, you're going to lose. If the enemy's got less restraint, and the Syrian government, indeed the Russian government, has really no restraint. This is a fight with no holds barred. There's nothing they won't do. Same as Putin's attitude to sport. You know, the Russian population is about 2% of the world population, but about 25% of those caught doping. And the World Anti-Doping Federation has caught them doping again and again and again. And athletes of all nationalities have been caught doping. There's an Irish athlete, Michel de Bruin, caught doing it. There's some UK athletes caught doing it, and so on. But one country stands out for the huge number, for the whistleblowers, the people right at the top, the head of the Russian anti-doping agency, fleeing to the United States and giving them all the particulars. This is exactly how it was done, organised by the FSB, Russia's internal intelligence agency, and they've been doing it for decades. The East Germans, when they're communists, they used to do it. It all came out in the wash. So that's it. Anyway, President Trump a few days ago tried to fulfill his campaign pledge, pulling out of Syria, and President Erdogan wanted to crush the Kurds. So the Kurds are an ethnic minority, about 25 million people, the largest ethno-linguistic group in the world without a country to call its own. So there you find them in the eastern part of Turkey, northwest Iran, northeast Syria, and northern Iraq. That circle spans 4 sovereign states. So they've got their own language. They're Sunni Muslims almost without exception, and they're divided into tribes, often very traditional. Sometimes there are honor killings amongst Kurds because this woman, they thought she was going out with a man who the family didn't approve of. So that's the Kurds. And after the First World War, they're supposed to give them their own homeland, but actually the Allies backed down and didn't do that in the end. So should they be part of Turkey or Iraq? Most of them preferred to be part of Iraq. They're the part of Iraq with most of the oil, so Iraq didn't want them to go independent. But in the so they've often been used as a weapon by one sovereign state against the others. The Iraqi government supporting the Iranian Kurds to rebel against Iran. The Iranian government supporting the Iraqi Kurds to rebel against Iraq. So the Kurds in Iraq, they can speak the Kurdish language. They can all speak Arabic as well, not always perfectly. And the Kurds in Turkey, most of them can speak Turkish. Some of them can't. Very few of them can't. And most of them speak Kurdish. Now, Öcalan, I think I pronounced his name correctly, Abdul Öcalan, was the leader of their rebellion in the 80s for ages. And he could only speak Turkish, apparently. Anyway, in the 70s into the 80s, there was a huge Kurdish rebellion in Turkey. And Turkey really tried to manufacture its identity when the Republic of Turkey was declared in 1922 because there was a Turkish language. But a lot of people in what's now Turkey who weren't ethnically Turkish, whatever that is, and you get Turks who are very white, you get Turks who are very brown, every shade in between, different phenotypes, those who look kind of oriental, because they started in Turkmenistan. They came from all parts of the Ottoman Empire. People were kidnapped as slaves, brought from Russia, brought from Spain, brought from Sudan. So they're not really an ethnic group. Even the founder of Turkey, Ataturk, he was born in what's now Greece, Thessaloniki, to Montenegrin and Albanian parents who are Muslims, all right, and they learnt Turkish. So it's not very clear who is Turkish. So you're not allowed to call yourself Kurdish. You have to call yourself a Mountain Turk and try to ban the language. So obviously the Kurds didn't like their being deracinated. So there was a huge rebellion. The PKK, the Kurdish Socialist Party, started. Indeed, in northern Iraq in the late 40s, there'd been a rebellion in this mountain fastness. And often they've been making money from heroin because it's the easiest way you can make money, to support the rebellion and just for money. But not all Kurds wanted to do this. They might support the Turkish government to be neutral. Large numbers of them killed. So again, a particularly horrific conflict. And the Turkish army did not always behave ethically. I mean, I know in counterinsurgencies, armies often behave badly. But I'm afraid to say the Turkish army was particularly bad, partly because there's no free media. The Turkish media is not allowed to report this, keeping foreign journalists out. And insulting Turkishness is a crime. If you say anything critical of the army, that was a crime. That's the way it goes. So having to really, in the 1920s, promote the language, posters up in Turkey saying, citizens speak Turkish, because some of them were ethnically Greek, mostly driven out, ethnically Armenian, or some of them had been killed, and there are various other local languages, promoting the Turkish language and identity. So that rebellion finally sort of stopped in the late 90s. Öcalan is on a prison on an island in Turkey, serving a life sentence, but he's called for reconciliation between Turks and Kurds. Erdogan absolutely detests Kurdish nationalists. I bet some Kurds in Turkey say, oh, well, actually it's all right, we're treated decently. So should Kurdistan be independent? I don't have a strong view about it. But obviously, in the 80s, the Kurds had rebelled against in Iraq, and Saddam Hussein had crushed them, carried out genocide, tens of thousands of Kurdish civilians deliberately killed by the Iraqi military. Up until that point, some Kurds had been conscripted into the Iraqi army, and indeed I met one who deserted to the Iranians, saying, I'm not dying for these bastards, as in Saddam Hussein's government. So anyway, that's that. So since 1991, the end of the Gulf War, there was a no-fly zone in northern Iraq, and the Kurds have been able to set up their own independent state, Kurdistan. But and then when Iraq finally became a free country, Jalal Talabani, a Kurd, became the president of Iraq. And then a couple of years ago, the Kurds in northern Iraq declared independence, but no other country has recognized them as that. The Iraqis don't want to lose some of their land, particularly with some of the oil, and the Turks don't want that, because if you're going to have Iraqi Kurdistan, why do you have Turkish Kurdistan? The two unite, create a Kurdish majority country, take some Kurdish land from Syria and then Iran or something like that. But anyway, So the United States announced it was pulling out. The Kurds have been some of the doughtiest fighters against the ISIS, the Peshmergas, are the Kurdish fighters. There's a very free country, Kurdistan, as in that's northern Iraq. I even consider going to work there. So they can all speak Kurdish, and often they don't bother learning Arabic anymore. Learning English is their foreign language. What else are going to point out? So that their fortitude is something to be admired, and they had to fight to the death because they're fighting for very self-preservation, because so many have been killed by the Iraqi government under Saddam Hussein. So as the United States is pulling out, the Kurdish government, already occupying a strip of Syria against the Syrian government's wishes, is going to move further in, because the Syrian government can't even control its own country. Assad is so detested that he's just got no power to control most of the land. He only was clinging on by his fingertips with massive foreign support, because most Syrians hated him. But anyway, I know some of his enemies are even worse. I absolutely abominate Bashar al-Assad, but if I had to choose between him and ISIS, I would prefer Dr. Assad. Then there was an outcry against Donald Trump. Our allies been thrown to the wolves yet again. Why should anyone trust us if we show such inconstancy? You've got to stand by your friends. Ronald Reagan wouldn't approve. So they gallantly battled ISIS. The Kurdish plight is an ethno-nationalist one. They don't practice a shared religion. They're scattered in multiple countries and speak different languages. Well, they've all got the Kurdish language, though not all of them can speak it. And they are in different sovereign states, but they are Sunni Muslim almost to a man. Anyway, so the Turkish army is pushing in there trying to fight against the Kurds. Kurds probably strike a deal, be neutral in this conflict against Assad. They've managed to normally say out of fighting the Ba'athists, they'll fight against ISIS. And they might just say, well, we might have to go the other way and say, ISIS, can we make a deal to both fight against the Turkish government? We'll see. Anyway, some Russian company, I think it was Rosneft, bought some pipelines a couple of years ago in Turkey leading to Iraq. So I hope to see you at Speaker's Corner one day. I'll spread the word about your channel. I've spoken at Speaker's Corner. The condition of Kurds resembles the appalling ethnic cleansing of Bosniaks during the Bosnian War. Well, indeed, really no friends in the world. The significant Kurdish communities abroad in Austria and Germany and Switzerland, I've seen their demonstrations, or Orsalan flags. Am I right in pronouncing it? Orsalan or Öcalan, Abdullah Öcalan. And some Kurds loathe him, saying he's a brute. And ironic that he can't speak the Kurdish language. So, but you know, if people can get access to Iraqi Kurdistan and send oil out through those pipelines through Turkey, that Russian company Rosneft, the major Russian oil company, will stand to make a killing in both senses. So Turkey is a NATO country, you know, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a founder member in 1949, and that was crucial for NATO because it bordered with the then Soviet Union, what we now call Georgia and Armenia. And obviously it has a Black Sea coast, it's got a Mediterranean Sea coast, and it was a major achievement for NATO to get Turkey and Greece into bed because the two were at each other's throats. Remember, Greece had been Yunanistan, this Turkish colony, for centuries, and there's very bad blood between them. A lot of massacres when Greeks rebelled, even into the 1920s, that what the Turks called the War of National Salvation, when the Turks said the Megali Idea, the Great Plan, will go back to, remember when the Aegean Sea was not the western edge, sorry, the eastern edge of Greece, it was the middle of Greece, because Greece is what we now call Greece, and it was a bit of Asia Minor, what we now call Turkey. So remember, a lot of those Greek myths are set in what's now Turkey, and a lot of the early Christian sites are in what's now Turkey. So they'd attacked Turkey, and there was a significant Greek minority in Western Turkey back then, just as there was a significant Turkish minority in Greece back in the 1920s. And that's when the Turks evacuated their capital from Istanbul to Ankara, where it is to this day. We used to call it Angora, like Angora wool. But anyway, and so the Greek army penetrating deep into Anatolia, but Ismet Inonu inflicting a large defeat at them, and then the Greeks fleeing for the coast, getting to Smyrna, the last major Greek city on the Aegean, on the eastern shore of the Aegean, and fleeing. Anyone who couldn't flee was put to the sword. It's now called Izmir, that city. Take what's his name, Jackie O's husband, Aristotle Onassis. He was from there, what we now call Turkey, that was definitely Greek. And I've been to some of these abandoned Greek villages in Turkey. You can see all the houses, the churches, everyone left in the early 20s. Because the Greeks and the Turks, they did population exchange back then. So let's have ethnically coherent states. All the Greeks in Turkey go to Greece, all the Turks in Greece go to Turkey. And that was that. Strangely, well, Rhodes was accepted from that because that was Italian ruled from 1911 to 1945. Anyway, so they were a NATO country, but and that was, they were worried that Russia might invade them. Remember, they fought 6 wars against Russia in 200 years, the last one being the First World War. The Ataturk and the Soviets actually had a fairly good relationship. They said, you want to crush the Armenians, so do we, and they both come in and smash them, and Armenia had been forced to join the Soviet Union, despite the fact that Lenin said the minor nationalities, if they want to go independent, they're allowed to. Quickly change his tune, no self-determination for them, and crush them. And anybody who talks about even peacefully achieving real autonomy, not even independence for Armenia, you're going to the Gulag. You're going to a slave labor camp for years, put in a cattle truck. We'll be working very long hours on starvation wages. There'll be random beatings. You won't have adequate clothing or adequate heating and no medical care. Be lucky if you survive. And some of them are just tortured and executed. And that was done to all minority groups in the Soviet Union. So anyway, there was a Russian jet flew over Turkish territory in late 2015. Just a few seconds and Turkish airspace was shot down. The two countries had very bad blood at the time. But remember that July attempted coup, July 2016 in Turkey. And were Western countries behind it, saying, oh, Erdogan is undermining secularism. Oddly, the army in Turkey in some ways is a liberal force. So all Turkish boys are supposed to do military service. You can avoid it if you prove that you're gay and in the passive role, because you're not really gay if you give, only if you take. That's the idea. Anyway, but if you're wealthy, you can pay to just do 1 month living in a barracks. I mean, it's as corrupt as hell, I'm afraid. I would do it. I don't want to be a soldier. But anyway, the top brass, they'd upheld the Kemalist tradition. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founder of the Turkish Republic, you know, he believed in the Enlightenment, to some extent secularism, separate mosque and state. The law of the land is not from the Quran. You want to be religious? Fine, but we will not facilitate you. Ramadan, you want to fast? We don't care. We used to have to work ordinary hours. Shops and restaurants are allowed to be open during Ramadan. You want to go to the mosque? Fine, but no pressure. And there's no prayer. In the old days, no prayer rooms in school, army barracks, police stations, anything. You want to pray, that's up to you. That's a private matter. The state will not support you or oppose you. But anyway, Erdogan, his party, the AK Party, Justice and Development Party, people say it's not Kemalist, it's trying to bring a Sharia state. I thought it was a major exaggeration. It somewhat undermined secularism. So the military said we're guardians of the Kemalist tradition, as in Ataturk secularist tradition, and they'd held a couple. They'd brought about a couple of military coups before, and at other times they've been almost like simply ordering civilians do this, or it is a military coup. As recently as the mid-90s, and the civilian government just backed down. But anyway, this attempt to overthrow him, it went off half-cocked. I don't want to tell the whole story here. About 300 people killed in one night. Some people say, was it even a false flag operation? Did he make it happen to give him an excuse to have this crackdown, to abridge civil liberties so severely, or what? But anyway, so that succeeded for him, and he purged the army, the police, civil servants, even teachers. So tens of thousands of people jailed, tens of thousands of people sacked, cracking down the Gulen Foundation. Now, Gulen, he lives in the United States. Fethullah Gulen set up this organization named in honor of himself, and it believes in sort of modern conservative Islam. So yes, we definitely believe in Islam. No alcohol, no smoking, if you remember that organization, no gambling. Women must dress modestly. They don't have to cover their hair, but they will dress from the throat to the ankles, and they will wear long sleeves, even in the height of summer. But they believe in evolution, they believe in science, think that's compatible with Islam. They're often teachers, engineers, doctors, things like that. They run loads of schools all over the world. But apparently, although actually Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the president, and Fethullah Gulen hate each other. Apparently it's just a personality clash. Their ideology is actually quite similar. Gulen lives in Pennsylvania. Anyway, that's Turkey. And people say they've been trying to rig elections and blah, blah, blah. But, you know, the AK Party doesn't have every seat in the Turkish Grand Assembly, as in their parliament. So he's an authoritarian, Erdogan. He published a notorious poem in the late 90s which strongly hinted at setting up a Sharia state. There's unfair trials, there's no freedom of expression. Insulting Turkishness is still a crime. they say you're allowed to criticize Ataturk but not insult him. Effectively, you can't criticize him because they'll say that you're offending the memory, the founder of the Turkish Republic, you're in jail. So there's this cult of the personality growing around Erdogan, who's been either prime minister or president since 2002. So it's increasingly chauvinistic, believing in fighting without any ethical limit, jingoistic, neo-Ottomanism. The Ottoman Empire, all right, had a few good things for it, but it had a lot of bad things for it. I mean, what scientific breakthroughs did it have? I can't think of any. How did it grant people more rights? It didn't abolish slavery, it retained slavery. It didn't advance women's rights, it didn't really spread education. It wasn't scientifically advanced, it didn't engage in large engineering products. You know, European colonialism can offer all these defences. You might think they're not sufficient, but you can't even offer such a defence with the Ottoman Empire. So Erdogan is militaristic. He seems to be expansionist with regard to Syria. He believes in closing down dissent by calling it extremism, despite him one really being the extremist. So where next? So Trump is a complete flip-flopper. He has performed a U-turn in double quick time, saying, I'm going to keep the troops there, but I think he'll perform a volte-face again. He wants to fulfill that election pledge to disengage from the Middle East, feels as a quagmire. Is there any American interest in Syria? I don't think so. You know, does the average American care who rules Syria? Does he know? I doubt it. You know, I think a lot of people in the United States couldn't spell Syria. Well, why should they? It's very far away. They don't trade much with Syria, never have done. It doesn't border the United States, it borders Israel. The Zionist lobby, obviously they don't like Assad, but it's a bit like Kissinger said about the Iran-Iraq war. I suppose from the Zionist perspective, it's a pity they can't both lose, because they think, obviously, ISIS hates their guts, absolutely fanatical, but Assad is probably a more effective enemy. When he comes to visit Trump, his guards beat protesters. Well, wouldn't surprise me, yeah. Anyway, so who rules in Syria is unimportant to the United States. I will tell you one thing, it's never going to be someone who's pro-American. They couldn't spell Canada. Well, you're probably right. Canada, that's how Sarah Palin used to pronounce it. You know, you see how the United States has undergone this lugubrious degeneration. 11 years ago, stupidity was thought to be a disadvantage if you're going for the vice presidency. Now, if you're going for the presidency, stupidity is somehow attractive to people. Hello, Louise Peacock. So anyway, I've been saying this from quite early on. Assad's Ba'athists will win in Syria, partly because they're just so utterly ruthless. The people I'd like to win, the Free Syria Army, the Syrian Democratic Forces, they're not savage enough, and they're not enough of them. So, you know, if it was a completely fair election, some people vote for the Ba'athists, some people vote for ISIS, some people vote for the Syrian Democratic Forces, something like that, or for various separatist groups, Kurds and so on. But so the sort of people I'd like to see won't win. And that's it because, you know, Assad's regime will just do anything. Canada, hope the Liberals form the majority there. So there have been many chemical attacks carried out by the Russian military, and they'll say, no, 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 you can't prove it. Who else has this stuff, has all these chemicals? They've done it again and again and again, and obviously only killing people in territory held by ISIS. ISIS is evil, but they don't have the means to use chemical weapons. They would if they could, but why would they kill their own fighters and kill civilians under their own control? It doesn't make sense. But no matter how illogical, no matter how ridiculous, Moscow will keep up these flagrant lies, just like Assad. And I've seen these interviews with them on BBC saying, I never ordered my people to be brutal. Well, they were brutal, so you obviously can't control your army. So he's very soft-spoken. It might seem difficult to work up a hatred. It might not seem that he's such a brute when he comes across as maybe gentlemanly, urbane, restrained, but clearly he is sort of bloodless. Anyway, so Syria is completely broken. Russia will have won it, but it's cost them quite a lot of money. It's not been very easy, and the Russian public is getting tired of it. And they've got bases there that have them even more. Assad wants to make sure this never ever happens again. Why is the US withdrawing now when they know what happened? They betrayed the Kurds. Well, good question. As I was saying, Trump is fed up with this. He wants to honour his election promise. Not that he cares about honour, but he thinks if he doesn't pull out of the Middle East, that might cost him the election. He vowed to pull out of Iraq, out of Syria, and out of Afghanistan. He's not pulled out of any of them. You know, you're a Trumpster. You voted for him last time. He's not done all that. He hasn't built the wall. He's not even going to claim to build a wall. Mexico has not paid a single peso towards it. They vow that they never ever shall. He has not brought back manufacturing jobs. He has not won that trade war with China. What else? He has not drained the swamp. He has not kicked out Wall Street from the White House. He has not continued to fund Medicare. He has not continued to fund Medicaid. He has not built up the US military. He's decreased it by taking billions of dollars from the military and spending it on this impossible to construct border barrier. I can't think what else he hasn't done. So you're being disappointed again and again and again. And he has not reduced immigration. He's not completely stopped Muslims moving to the US, either as tourists or to live there or to gain citizenship. Presidents all the same, they're just puppets to comply with the US military complex, wasting money and building a worthless war. Well, they don't have to, but Trump's chosen to. You are the commander-in-chief, so show some balls. You're so tough, as you tell us. He won't privatise the NHS, the National Health Service in the United Kingdom. No, I don't think he will. There already is private healthcare in the UK if you want it. So he wants to finally fulfill some election pledges. Well, he's done it with regard to Israel by shifting the US embassy to Jerusalem. So he's done exactly what the Zionists want. They're very, very happy with him. The only countries where he's highly rated, foreign countries, are Russia and Israel. Now, why would that be? Because he's at their beck and call. He's not completely done what Russia wants. They still send weapons to the Ukraine. Maybe there's a limit to what even he can do. And you know, if you're Russian, you're pissed off with him. Do you want to embarrass him if you've got compromising material? Do you want to dish the dirt? Maybe not. Maybe because then they'll lose and you'll have someone worse in charge. Not Hillary Clinton, but some of her mindset. Now, I loathe Hillary Clinton, but she's a sane adult. And I wouldn't say either of those things about Donald Trump. So someone of her mindset, she's a little bit predictable, very calculating. She does have a few bedrock beliefs in foreign affairs. So you know what she's going to do. Trump, there's really no telling which way he'll pivot. Israel, half the US Congress and the president under their leash. Well, I think you under-exaggerate because most politicians in the US Congress, they're in receipt of AIPAC money or from another Zionist organization. You can see my video about this. And obviously, what's AIPAC about? That's foreign influence, if nothing else. Because I know that Israeli citizens are not allowed to donate, but there are some people who are joint citizens. And we all know it's making the United States dance to Israel's tune. Now, the Israelis are doing this very open. I've got to applaud them for being so successful. And they're not only in Hollywood. Can you think of a single Hollywood film which shows Israel in a negative light? Can you think of any Hollywood film which shows Muslims or Arabs badly? There are plenty. There's been a study that's real bad Arabs. Arabs in Hollywood films, 90% shown as evil characters, 5% as neutral, and only 5% as good. So, anyway, and the US media and so on. Now, Israel's not all bad. Going a bit off topic, there are things which can be said in favour of Israel and the many horrific Arab governments that have just been laying into Assad. It annoys me so much because Israel bends the USA to its own will and drains it with the military. So yeah, they obviously want to see Syria trashed, and that's worked, but many Syrians wanted to see Assad overthrown as well. Saddam Hussein was a major enemy of theirs as well. He was also a thoroughly wicked man, so I shed no tears to see him hanged, and that's that. So Syria is extremely in debt to Russia. It's got no way of ever repaying that, financially in debt and morally in debt, and to China and to Iran. So there are going to be Russian bases there forever, even more, maybe perhaps Iranian ones, which the Israelis really don't want. So the Russians might have to persuade the Iranians to pull out, but the Iranians are going to say, well, what are we going to get for pulling out? Israel better give us some security guarantees or something. The Chinese don't seem to be wanting to set up debts there. Could they build something? But what's in it for the Chinese? They're not going to make any money, and money's the bottom line. They drive a very hard bargain. You get no generosity out of them. They will argue over every last penny. So there's going to be no chance of reform or democracy there. Yes, there are various different parties, but they're all really pro-Assad ones. It's really just a pretense of a multi-party system. And all the time before this civil war, people having to swear loyalty to President Assad at football matches and so on. Saddam, even though he placed out of power, he never had terrorist issues at a stable nation, safer under his rule. The hell is now. Well, I think you're dead wrong. I was just telling you about Kurdistan. For decades, I was fighting in Kurdistan. That's not stability. The Marsh Arabs rebelled against him. There were several rebellions against him. In 1991, there were in the mid-90s. So no, there weren't. I mean, he deliberately killed hundreds of thousands of his people, sometimes by simply having them shot dead or gassed, but some by deliberately malnourishing people and withholding medicines. That's not, is that what you want? A graveyard? Is that stability? Is that peace? The whole oil for food program. So after 1991, the sanctions, until he dismantled his weapons of mass destruction in a verifiable manner, it behoved him to prove it to the world community, to let the UN inspectors see that because if they didn't do that, we had to assume he had all the weapons of mass destruction, which he declared an inventory in 1991 as part of the ceasefire. And if you don't honour the ceasefire terms, the conflict continues. So the oil for food program, Iraq was allowed to sell a certain amount of oil and use that money only for food and medicine. It should be called oil for food and medicine program. But he deliberately withheld a lot of that from his Iraqi people to malnourish them and to make people die preventively of diseases which could be cured, just weren't given the medicines and the medical equipment, to then blame that on Western countries. Hello, Burak Bayram. Bayram Festival, that's your surname. I wonder what Burak means. So, yeah, I'm afraid I don't have a terribly high opinion of your president. I'm not remotely anti-Turkish. Let that be crystal clear, because you can dislike a president and government its policies without being against the country. For example, I'm fairly critical of Boris Johnson. I'm not anti-British. Actually, Dr. Varadkar, well, I think he's fairly good egg. I disagree with him a little bit. Doesn't mean I'm anti myself, not anti-Irish. So that's that. And obviously there are plenty of Turkish people who are against Erdogan as well. Notice that the G with a breve above it in Turkish is silent. It's not Erdogan, okay? Whereas in Azerbaijani it'd be Erdogan. The G is like so that's that. Anyway, I think within about a year, the major combat operations will be over. Perhaps it's a fool's errand to make these predictions in relation to Syria. So the Kurds are going to fight. Well, they sort of got to, and they may say that attack is the best form of defense instead of start setting up bombs in Turkey to destroy the tourist trade or something. Gaddafi was known as Mad Dog in the Middle East. Well, that's what Reagan called him. Gaddafi setting off bombs in US military bases in West Germany and helping the IRA against the United Kingdom. Okay, he obviously wouldn't allow any autonomy to anywhere in Libya. Some people speak Arabic, some people speak Berber, the different tribes. And Libya was created by the Italians. Because remember, they attacked this Ottoman province in 1911 and conquered it. Didn't really control much inland from the coast, brought in a few Italian settlers. It was 3 Ottoman provinces: Tripolitania around Tripoli, Fezzan, which is the Sahara, and Cyrenaica, which is the eastern part of the country. And the Italians look back into the chronicles. Oh, in ancient Roman times, what does it say? There in the annals is the word Libya. We'll just call it Libya. So they called it that in the 1930s. So they're different tribes and so on, but he ruled them. So obviously this it wasn't even one party. It was his system, and having to lord the leader and massive state terror. But there were some achievements. I absolutely detest Gaddafi, but I recognise it was quite good economic growth. There was more or less 100% literacy by the end. There were some decent public services. So yes, he's evil, but he also achieved a few things. There's no contradiction there. The only Irish school outside of Ireland is in Libya, the International School of Martyrs, because he thought the IRA was so fantastic for what a bit like him to deny people free speech, fair elections, free, fair trials and so on. Gaddafi was overthrown because he tried to make a universal currency in Africa backed by gold. There was that theory they stopped using the dollar and that Hillary Clinton wanted him overthrown, and she even quipped about it in some interview with CNN. You know, he was caught. He was caught and killed. He died, something like that. She was saying rather flippantly. So he was killed by his own people when he was caught. So with relatively little outside help, he was overthrown. The Qataris wanted him overthrown. I'm not quite sure why, because Qatar is a royal dictatorship. They're despots there. There's not much freedom of expression there. They'll get Al Jazeera. Why would they particularly care? And even now in this second Libyan civil war, mysterious jets from another Middle Eastern country, probably Qatar, are bombing there. Now, many Sunni Muslims are against ISIS, like the Jordanians. There are Sunni Muslims, the great majority of them, and they've been bombing ISIS as well. So that's that. Coming to an end. Fortunately, I hope, Kurds managed to survive. Maybe they can have some sort of autonomy within Syria. Airstrikes and CIA training 5,000 rebels 150 miles away from Tripoli. Right now, that would be odd, because the US has got a reasonable relationship with the Libyan government. The other odd thing is Trump spoke on the phone to Khalifa Haftar, that Russian-backed rebel who's trying to overthrow the lawful government. He is an American, of course, Haftar, an American Libyan. But surely Trump would say, don't do that. But then Trump knows nothing and doesn't really care. And will go both ways in the same issue. The US has just did an hour ago, Turkish-backed rebels fired artillery near the USA and he moves loads of rebels near the USA convoys. No, I didn't know that. So Turkey's is a NATO member. The thing is, Turkey might pull out of NATO. They bought the S-400 missile defense system from Russia, and the United States vigorously lobbied against it, but the Turks did it anyway, who hacked off with the United States for various reasons. Trump has repeatedly fulminated against them, threatened to wreck the Turkish economy through sanctions. And obviously, if the United States pushes Turkey too far, the Turks will say, we're out of NATO. They could be neutral, which even that would be a game changer, or go right the other way and become a Russian ally, sign up that collective security treaty, be part of the collective security treaty organization. It's just Russia and about 5 erstwhile Soviet republics. But what if they invite Russian troops there, have Russian military bases there? You know, the Russian Navy having more bases in the Mediterranean, it'd be their dream come true. They've always wanted free passage through the Dardanelles onto the Aegean and the Mediterranean Sea. I know they've got those bases in Syria, but you know, if the Bosphorus is closed to them, then they're screwed, because the Bosphorus is only about a kilometre wide at the narrowest point. That's where the Black Sea connects to the Aegean. Okay, right through where Istanbul is, that's the Bosphorus. That's what, you know, the Hellespont, or where who was it, Leander supposedly swims across it in one ancient Greek myth. So that's enough about Endgame in Syria. What I think is going to happen. Gradually wind down, just exhaustion. There's a limited number of people who are willing to fight for ISIS. They most have been killed, badly wounded, imprisoned, or they fled. Not many more foreign volunteers going there. It's clearly a lost cause. So Assad is going to win. He's going to preside over a heap of ruins, over an absolutely wrecked economy, and most of the intelligentsia have fled. Unless you're zealously pro-Assad, there's really nothing there for you. Gone to Europe or elsewhere. Okay, so please donate to me on PayPal, georgecallahan79@gmail.com. Callahan, that's CALLAGHAN, georgecallahan79@gmail.com. Turkey released 900 ISIS forces in a Kurdish prison. Okay, why? They want to support ISIS, you're claiming? ISIS, which is completely against the Turkish Republic, they've been trying to crush. Doesn't make sense. Or you can donate to me on Patreon. Book me with me lessons online, English literature, English as a foreign language, French, history, law, let me see, geography, religious studies, politics and government, things of that nature. I'm a tour guide online, book me. So, Bayram, you're saying that that was a lie. Yeah, it's difficult, I don't know, it's difficult to know what to believe sometimes, claim and counterclaim. Okay, good night.